They tell me I'm a survivor. They write it on the intake forms, stamp it on my transfer papers, use it the way people use words when they've run out of anything honest to say. Survivor. As if what happened out on Rathbone's land was something I survived the way you survive a car crash, shock and bruising, and a lot of paperwork afterward. I was there, I know what the word costs. My name is Jason Keller. Before all this, I was a survey technician for a geological firm out of Bristol, which meant I drove long stretches of empty English countryside with a clipboard and a soil probe, and enough coffee to stay vertical. I mapped subsidence. I took samples from fields and riverbanks and the margins of old quarry workings, and fed the data into a system that told developers whether the ground under their intended car park was going to behave. It was work that required patience and a specific relationship with silence, and I was good at it. Before the survey work, I did 4 years in the Royal Engineers, 2 of them in places I still don't talk about at dinner. Bridging work in one, mine clearance in the other. The mine clearance was not what people picture when they picture mine clearance. It is methodical and slow and almost entirely boring, and then it is briefly extremely not boring, and the quality of attention required for the boring parts, the sustained, calibrated alertness, is what keeps you alive during the other kind. I left the engineers with that quality of attention intact, and most of the rest of me intact, and no strong desire to discuss it further. The combination of backgrounds mattered in the end, not because I was some kind of hero. I want to be clear about that from the start, and I want to stay clear about it throughout. I made mistakes that night that I will carry until I don't carry anything anymore. But I knew how to read ground. I knew how to move through the dark without making a production of it. I knew how to keep moving when the situation required it, and how to stop when stopping was the better option. And I knew from hard experience that when something wants to kill you, the worst thing you can do is stand still and try to reason with it. That knowledge is the only reason I'm sitting here talking to you instead of being filed under a category I don't have clearance to see. Let me start with what I knew going in, which wasn't much. And let me start a little before the night itself, because what happened on that estate didn't begin when we parked the car. It began in a flat in Bristol on a Saturday 3 weeks earlier, and it began, as most things in my experience begin, with someone who was curious about something that should have been left alone. Kirsty was the one who found the articles. She was studying forensic anthropology at the time, which meant she spent a lot of her waking hours thinking about how bodies decompose and what they leave behind, and she had developed a tolerance for disturbing information that the rest of us hadn't quite matched. She worked with the patience of someone who finds evidence interesting regardless of what the evidence is evidence of, and she had the particular quality that all good researchers share, which is that she followed things to their end rather than stopping at the point where the following became uncomfortable. She showed us the printouts one Saturday evening in Sophia's flat, old newspaper clippings, a scanned journal entry, a few pages from what looked like an inquest report with certain sections blacked out by hand. The blacking out had been done with a marker rather than in the original, which meant someone had blacked them out after the fact and before the scanning. Someone had made a decision about what to obscure, which is its own kind of information. Baron Rathbone IV, that was the name in all of them. The details were thin the way old local legends always are, part documented fact, part telephone game, part something the village had collectively decided to stop talking about. Rathbone had owned a substantial stretch of farmland and woodland in the hills north of a village I'll leave unnamed, not because I'm being cagey, but because I genuinely don't think the name helps anyone. He was described, depending on which account you read, as a scientist, a benefactor, an eccentric, or, in the oldest piece Kirsty had found, handwritten on paper that had gone the color of old teeth, as something considerably worse. Clive Jackson, a local antiquary whose name appeared in 2 of the clippings, described Rathbone as a man of considerable means and considerable appetites, which was the Victorian construction for several things at once. The inquest report was dated 30 years prior. It concerned the disappearance of Rathbone and 3 of his household staff. Cause of death was listed as unknown. One witness, name redacted, gave testimony that described sounds from the manor house over a period of several weeks before the disappearance, prolonged, irregular sounds, not animal exactly, but not human either. The witness had used the phrase beyond natural order, which the inquest had noted without comment. The inquest concluded that Rathbone had likely died as a result of injuries sustained during an incident with one of his research animals. The manor and its grounds had been purchased by a private holding company shortly after the inquest closed. The holding company was registered to an address that, if you looked it up, went nowhere. Kirsty had looked it up. She thought it was fascinating. Ben thought it would make a good weekend. Ben Tramer was a person who had made a hobby of treating things that should have been warnings as invitations. He had the particular energy of someone who has never been seriously harmed by his own decisions, and has therefore updated in the wrong direction, toward the conclusion that his decisions don't cause serious harm. He was not stupid. He was something more dangerous, which is smart in most situations and confident across all of them. I'd known him for 6 years, and I liked him because his energy was genuinely warm. The risk-taking was never at anyone else's expense that he could see, and he was the kind of person who, in a group, takes the initiative so that other people don't have to. He was also, on balance, an idiot about certain things. The Rathbone estate was going to turn out to be one of those things. He'd already printed out driving directions and put wine in a cooler bag. Sophia was in, because Sophia was always in on anything Ben suggested. And before anyone takes that the wrong way, let me say that Sophia Lennon was one of the sharper people I've known, and her willingness to go along with Ben's ideas was not the product of poor judgment on her part. It was the product of a calculated assessment that Ben's ideas, even the bad ones, were usually interesting, and that interesting was worth occasional risk. She had been right about that more often than not, which was the problem. Kirsty was in because it was her find, and because she had follow-up questions that she could only answer on the ground. Which left me. I said fine. I want that on record. I said fine, not yes, and I said it in the tone of voice a person uses when they know something is a bad idea and they're going along anyway because the alternative is sitting alone in a flat on a Saturday waiting for Monday. I did not feel good about it. I packed a torch, a folding knife, a first aid kit the size of a paperback, and a thermos of coffee, and I told myself that the preparation was evidence that I was being sensible about it. The preparation was not evidence of that. We drove out on a Friday evening, Ben at the wheel, Kirsty reading from her printouts in the passenger seat, Sophia and I in the back watching the country go dark around us. England has a particular quality in the late evening of autumn, the fields going from green to gray to the specific non-color of darkness, the hedges becoming solid walls of blackness, the villages appearing briefly as clusters of lit windows and then receding. It is a landscape that was old before the concept of mapping was invented, and it carries that oldness in its bones. The last town we passed through was small and closed-looking, the kind of place where the pub empties early and the curtains don't move when you walk past. We stopped for petrol at a garage where the attendant looked at our plates and then at us and didn't say anything that wasn't strictly necessary. I noticed that. I'm nodding it here not to establish atmosphere, but because it was a real thing that happened. A man at a petrol station who looked at us and chose not to ask where we were going, the way people choose not to ask questions they don't want the answers to. I noticed the way his eyes went to the road north when we asked which direction the old Rathbone property lay. I noticed the way he looked back at his register without answering. Ben noticed that he was out of crisps and asked if there was another shop. The road north was single-track tarmac for the first few miles, then gravel, then dirt that hadn't been graded in what looked like decades. The trees came in close on both sides after a while. Old trees, oak and ash, the kind with bark like broken stone and root systems that had been working at the subsoil since before anyone now living was born. Roots surfaced across the track in ridges, and you felt them through the chassis as the car moved over them. The headlights did what headlights do in that kind of country, which is illuminate a narrow corridor and make everything outside it feel compressed and present. Things moved in the margin of the light, rabbits, once what looked like a fox, and the trees between them were still. We parked in a lay-by about half a mile from what Kirsty's map said was the edge of the estate. Ben wanted to drive up to the house itself. I talked him out of it on the grounds that the track didn't look like it could take the car, which was true, and because something about the quality of the silence when I stepped out to look made me want us to approach on foot, which I kept to myself. There is a particular kind of silence that is the absence of expected sound. Night country has ambient noise, insects, wind in the canopy, distant animal movement. When those sounds are present, quiet is comfortable. When they're absent, the quiet is the sound of something else having gone quiet because of something you haven't located yet. The silence in that lay-by when I stepped out of the car was the second kind. It was cold, clear. No moon yet, but stars enough to navigate by once your eyes adjusted. We walked in single file with one torch between us, Ben's idea of packing light, and Kirsty narrated from her notes as we went, keeping her voice low the way people instinctively do in old woodland at night. Rathbone's work, as near as the inquest could establish, had begun as legitimate veterinary research. He had funding from sources that were never fully traced. He had credentials from institutions that were real but distant enough that no one visited. The first 10 years of his tenure at the estate appeared, from the documentary record, to have been conventional if eccentric. A wealthy man with private means and a serious interest in comparative anatomy. He published 3 papers in the early years, 2 in journals that still existed, 1 in a journal that had been dissolved so thoroughly that even the institutional libraries Kirsty checked had no record of it. Over the course of approximately a decade, the scope of what he was doing in the manor's outbuildings had apparently shifted, though shifted was the polite word, and Kirsty's notes were careful to distinguish between what the inquest found and what the village believed. The inquest found evidence of unlicensed laboratory work. The village believed that Rathbone had stopped working on animals somewhere around year 7. I asked her what that meant. She said she didn't know exactly. She said the inquest report used the phrase ungodly hybridization and then immediately clarified that this reflected the witness's characterization rather than a clinical finding. I asked her who the witness was. She said the name was redacted. I asked who had done the redacting. She said she didn't know. We came through the tree line into a clearing, and I stopped walking. The manor was there. 3 stories, stone, the kind of architecture that was built to last and had lasted in the way that things last when no one is maintaining them, persisting, slowly being consumed by what grows around and over it. Ivy had colonized the east wing to the roofline. Several windows on the upper floor were dark holes where the glass had gone. The facade was intact enough, but the detail work, the cornicing, the window surrounds, the carved stonework above the main entrance, had weathered down to suggestions of what it had been. The grounds between us and the main entrance were overgrown but not wild. That is a distinction I want to press on because it mattered. Wild is what happens when nothing manages a space. What I was looking at was managed neglected growth that had been permitted to the point where it obscured and screened and reduced visibility from the exterior while leaving the main roots between the buildings clear. Someone had thought about what the grounds looked like from outside the perimeter. Someone had decided what they should look like. There were outbuildings, 4 or 5, stone and timber construction, set at angles to the main house that didn't follow the logic of a working farm. A working farm arranges its outbuildings for access and function. These were arranged differently. I noted that and filed it. One of them had light in it. Not torch light, not lamplight. Something steadier, bluer, the kind of light that comes from instruments behind frosted glass or gauze. A functional, working light. The kind of light that means something inside is running and has been running for a while. I said we should leave. Ben said there was someone there, and that was interesting. Kirsty said the light was probably just reflected starlight off a broken pane. It was not reflected starlight, and I think Kirsty knew that too. I think she said it the way people say things they don't quite believe, when what they believe is more inconvenient than they want to deal with in the moment. I want to be honest about what came next, which means I need to say that I did not stop them. I should have. I had enough of a read on the situation, the sealed estate, the untraceable holding company, the lights in the outbuilding, the arranged grounds, the quality of the silence, to know that whatever was here was not simply a derelict property on public record. I had the instincts, carried over from the engineers, to trust the particular quality of unease that was sitting in my chest like a stone, and not move toward anything that was generating it. I didn't use those instincts. I followed Ben and Kirsty across the open ground toward the outbuilding with the light in it, and I told myself I was keeping them safe by staying close, which was true and also a convenient thing to tell myself. The outbuilding door was unlocked. It swung inward on a darkness that smelled of chemical antiseptic, and something beneath that copper, earth, the particular flat sweetness that I recognized from field dressings applied too late, from work in the engineers that I don't discuss at dinner. Inside, the blue light resolved into instrument panels, banks of them, floor to ceiling, set into the stone wall with the kind of bespoke fabrication that you don't buy in a catalog, and don't install without knowing exactly what you're doing. Cables ran in conduit along the ceiling. The panels displayed readings, numbers, graphs, waveforms that pulsed at irregular intervals. Some of the numbers were changing in real time. Something, somewhere, was producing the data those instruments were monitoring. In the center of the space, tables. Metal, with drainage channels cut into them and fitted drains at the low ends. Restraint points at intervals along the edges, not the kind you use to secure equipment in transit. The kind you use when what you're securing might object to being secured. Sophia made a sound and stepped backward into me. I put my hand on her arm and kept my eyes on the room. On the tables and on the shelving that lined the far wall, held in foam cutouts with the precision of a museum exhibit, were specimens. I am going to use that word, and I am going to mean it clinically because I don't have another word that keeps the distance I need to keep right now. They were biological. Some were clearly animal in origin, skeletal structures, organ preparations in sealed containers, tissue samples labeled in a hand I didn't recognize using a notation I didn't know. Others were less clearly anything, structures that suggested both and neither, arrangements that the eye tried to resolve into something familiar and couldn't quite manage. The brain, confronted with something that almost fits a category but doesn't, has a response to that almost, an unease that precedes understanding and is more animal than intellectual. I felt that response very strongly in that room, and I have given myself permission, after everything that followed, to trust it. Kirsty was at the far wall before I could stop her, reading labels. She had her notebook out. She was writing. Ben had his phone out, taking photographs. The scrape of his thumb on the camera icon was very loud in the silence. I was looking at the door we'd come through and calculating distance and direction back to the car, and thinking about what was between us and the car, and thinking about the arranged grounds and the active instrument readings, and the door that had been unlocked rather than locked, and reaching the end of that line of thinking in a way I didn't like. That was when we heard the sound from the main house. I have thought about how to describe it many times since, lying awake in the early hours of too many nights, staring at a ceiling and running the memory back. The closest I can get is this. It was vocalization. It had the basic architecture of a voice modulation, rhythm, something that might have been syntax if you listened at the right angle and with enough generosity. But the register was wrong. Not wrong in pitch exactly. Wrong in a more fundamental way, the way a musical instrument played by the wrong method sounds not just different but incorrect, wrong to the ear before the brain has processed why. It was a sound made by something that had learned the shape of communication from somewhere else and was using it imperfectly. It rose and fell twice, then stopped. No one in the room moved. Then Ben's phone flash went off. He had been trying to photograph the specimen tables and had forgotten to disable the flash. The crack of light against the walls was brief, flat. In any other circumstance it would have meant nothing. Here it meant we had just announced ourselves to whatever was producing the active readings on those instrument panels, and to whatever had made the sound from the main house, and to whatever was paying attention to the estate from the outside. I said very quietly that we were leaving now. I used the voice I'd learned to use in the engineers, the one that is not a request and is not a question and is not open to negotiation. Sophia was already moving toward the door. Kirsty took one more second at the shelving with her notes, her pen moving fast, capturing what she could. I held the door. Ben started to say something about the photographs, about whether we had enough. I put my hand on his collar and moved him toward the door without answering. Outside, the cold air and the open ground and the overgrown grass between us and the tree line, 200 meters of it with no cover worth the name. I put us into the grass on the outbuilding's east side, running low along the building's wall before angling away from it toward the trees. Not straight across, that would have meant being visible from the manor's front elevation for the full 200 meters. Angling meant the building's mass screened us for the first 50, and the angle itself meant less time exposed on the final 150. The engineers trained me to think in those terms automatically. I was grateful for it now. We made the tree line. I pushed us 30 meters in before I stopped, turning. From here the manor was visible in parts through the trunks, lit windows on the ground floor casting yellow rectangles onto the overgrown grass outside, the dark mass of the upper stories, and in the open ground between the outbuilding and the main house, a figure. The word figure is doing some work there that I want to be precise about. It was upright. That is the most accurate thing I can say about the category it occupied. The rest of it, the proportions of its limbs, the movement, the way it covered ground without quite resembling walking, did not have a clean category in my vocabulary, and I have a decent vocabulary for how things move, built over years of survey work and the engineers. It moved with the quality of something that had too many options available for each movement, as if the decision of how to move was being made in real time, selected from a wider set of possibilities than a person has. It stopped at the outbuilding door and stood there. It was not looking at the outbuilding. It was looking at the ground, moving its head slightly, as if reading the grass in front of it. It was tracking us by the impression we'd left in the wet grass. I did not say that to the others. I motioned us deeper into the trees. We moved for 10 minutes without speaking. Old woodland at night is not silent. It has its own ambient sounds, wind and settling and small things moving, but it is private in a way that open ground is not, and the tree cover helped with the sense of exposure if not with the actual risk. Ben moved quietly enough, which surprised me. Sophia moved like she'd done it before. Kirsty was not quiet, but she was consistent, her footfalls regular, which was better than irregular. Then Ben stopped and said he'd lost his bearings and didn't know which direction we'd come from. I checked the stars, found Polaris, matched the angle to the one we'd walked in on, and pointed southeast. Ben said he thought we'd come from the south, that the track had been south of us. I didn't engage with the argument because arguments take time, and time was what I was least confident we had. I pointed southeast and started walking. Here is what I did not know yet. I did not know that the estate was larger than Kirsty's map showed. The holding company had purchased parcels of adjacent farmland over the years, quietly, through intermediaries, in transactions small enough to avoid the attention that a single large purchase would have drawn. The total area under their effective control was something like 4 times what the original boundary suggested, and it had been expanded in directions that specifically covered the approaches from the village. I did not know that the outbuilding we'd entered was one of 7, arranged in a pattern that only made sense from above, which I established later from aerial mapping. I did not know that the figure we'd seen at the outbuilding door had not come from the manor house alone. I found out the second part when Sophia grabbed my arm and stopped walking. She pointed left without speaking. Through the trees, perhaps 60 meters, another shape moved. It was lower than the first one, lower not in the way a crouching person is lower, but in the way that something settles into a height that works for it, lower as a preference rather than a posture. It moved at a pace that was faster than walking, but without the vertical oscillation of running, fluid in a way that the terrain underfoot didn't seem to account for. It was not following our path. It was paralleling us, maintaining our pace, moving in the same direction. Maintaining, that's the word. It was not approaching, it was keeping station. I pushed us right without stopping to discuss it. New bearing, northwest, hopping to find the original track and use it to navigate out. The trees here were denser and older, the root systems making the ground uneven and the footing uncertain. Kirsty stumbled on a root and Ben caught her arm. I did not slow down. I was watching the spaces between the trunks on both sides. We heard the one behind us before we saw it. The sound it made was the one we'd heard from the manor house, that structured, wrong register vocalization but compressed now, shorter, percussive, clipped sounds repeated at intervals of a few seconds coming from behind us and from the left from 2 sources that were not the same distance away. I am familiar with the way sound moves through woodland. I had a decent sense of the distance and direction. 2 behind us, 1 on the left. The one we'd seen on the left was gone from where it had been, which meant it had moved. And then I understood what the sounds were. They were not distress calls. They were not alarm calls. They had the rhythm and regularity of directed communication, the back and forth of coordinated movement. The 2 behind us were communicating with each other. The one on the left that had vanished was receiving. The herding pattern that had formed around us was not instinctive. It had been organized in real time, using communication that was structured enough to carry specific instructions. This is the point in the account where I'm told some people struggle to believe what I'm saying. I understand that. Sitting in a room with a recording device and adequate light, and the comfortable normality of a building with a postcode, what I'm describing sounds like the product of fear-amplified perception and the dark playing tricks on tired eyes. I've thought about that possibility seriously, and I've given it more credit than most people would expect me to give it, because I believe in the principle that the mundane explanation should be exhausted before the extraordinary one is accepted. I've exhausted it, the evidence won't fit. What I know is this: the things on that estate were not human. They had been perhaps in some component of their origin, some foundational layer of them that Rathbone's work had built upon and departed from over 30 years of incremental modification. But what moved in those trees coordinated with each other, communicated with sound that had syntax, had better low-light capacity than we did. I could establish that by watching how they moved relative to shadow versus open starlight, how they neither slowed nor adjusted when the canopy thickened overhead. They tracked us through the grass. They organized a response to our presence in the time it took us to walk to the tree line. What they were not, I believe, and I am making this argument based on observation rather than reassurance, was human in the specifically improvised, break-the-rule, burn-the-template way that I was beginning to understand we were going to need. They were calibrated, they were organized, they had protocols. Protocols are tools of systems. Systems are designed for expected circumstances. Expected circumstances are not the same as all circumstances. We broke from the tree line onto a track I didn't recognize, not the one we'd come in on. Wider, with ruts from vehicle use, heavy vehicles, by the width of the ruts and the depth they'd pressed into the dirt, heading roughly north-south. South was toward the village. I turned us south and we ran. Running strips away everything except what you're doing, the ground underfoot and the air in your lungs and the distance ahead. Sophia was fast cross-country runner in school, and she'd maintained it, the kind of fitness that lives in the legs and the lungs rather than the gym. She could have been further ahead than she was, and she wasn't because she was staying with Kirsty, whose stride was shorter and who was flagging by the second 100 meters. Ben was not fast by any standard, but he had that quality I've mentioned, the refusal to slow down. He was not built for running, and he ran anyway, jaw set, breathing through his nose, eyes on the track ahead. I stayed at the rear. The sounds behind us were organized now. I could distinguish 3 separate sources, 1 on the track behind us, 2 in the trees flanking the track on either side. The one on the track was closing. The 2 in the trees were maintaining position, not rushing to cut us off, not falling back. Maintaining the angle, herding us along the track which they wanted us on, towards something the track led to, which I didn't know and couldn't afford to wait to find out. I grabbed Ben by the shoulder and pulled him sideways off the track into the grass verge without breaking stride. He caught himself and looked at me. I put my finger to my lips and pointed back up the track, then toward the trees on the east side, then moved my hand in a way that I hoped communicated what I meant. The one on the track is coming and will pass us. We go west now while it passes. Ben nodded. He was breathing hard and his face was doing something complicated and genuine, the look of someone processing a situation that has gone well past the comfortable range. But he nodded. We went into the trees on the west side, low and quiet, as far into the undergrowth as we could get in 10 seconds. The thing on the track passed us in the dark. I heard it, the sound of its movement on the compacted dirt, not footfalls exactly. The weight distribution was wrong, too many points of contact or too few, I couldn't establish which. And beneath the sound of its passage, that clipped vocalization, now at a higher register directed south, calling ahead to whatever was at the end of the track, reporting. It passed, kept going, the sound of it faded south. We waited 3 minutes, I counted each one. Then I moved us north, parallel to the track but inside the tree line, moving as quietly as 4 people without fieldcraft training can move, which is not very quietly but quieter than the track. The sounds from the tree line on the east side had gone quiet. I didn't know whether that meant the second flanker had moved south after the first or had stopped to listen. I moved us as if it had stopped to listen. I was trying to find the outbuilding complex. I know that sounds counterintuitive and I know how it reads. We'd found danger there. We triggered a response there. Going back was the opposite of the instinct that says get distance. But the outbuildings were stone construction, walls a foot thick, a door with an iron mounting bracket that would take a bar, roof over our heads, which in an open chase matters more than it sounds. The car was half a mile south on a route that was now compromised. The village was further south still, and I had no way of knowing whether the estate's range extended toward it. Stone walls and a door you could bar were what I had to work with, and I used what I had. We found the complex by the smell before we found it by sight. That antiseptic and copper combination carried further than the instrument light did, and I navigated by it, adjusting our bearing when it strengthened and weakening when it faded. When the lights appeared through the trees, I stopped us at the edge of the canopy and watched the open ground for 4 minutes. Nothing moved. I took us across at a diagonal, keeping low, moving fast, and got us through the outbuilding door. Sophia found the bar, a heavy iron bracket, 2 feet long, designed to drop into mounting points, and dropped it into place. The sound it made settling into the iron mounts was the most reassuring sound I'd heard in the last 40 minutes. I stood in the blue instrument light and looked at what was around me. Ben had his phone and the photographs from earlier. Poor quality, flash photography in a dark room, motion blur on several of them, but legible enough to read labels and notation on the specimen containers. Kirsty had her notes. I had the instrument panels themselves. Between the three sources, we began to reconstruct what Rathbone had actually been doing here and what the holding company had been maintaining since. The genetic notation on the specimen labels was not a system I recognized from any context. Kirsty recognized parts of it. She'd done a module on forensic genetics, and she'd encountered similar notation in theoretical literature on splice research. Theoretical because the applied version, as of the papers she'd read, had not produced stable results. The key word, she said, looking at the labels, might be had not, as of when those papers were written. Rathbone had begun with fauna, the local fauna that the legend mentioned, which in practice meant whatever animals were accessible from the estate. The early specimen preparations were vertebrate, recognizable, ordered in a progression that had a logic to it. The logic moved in a direction. The later specimens moved further from the recognizable. The furthest from the recognizable were also the most recent, by the date notations on the containers. The instrument panels were monitoring panels. The waveforms, I had context for them now from looking at the specimen preparations, were biological readings, not from the specimens in this room, from subjects in other locations, other outbuildings, monitored in real time. Some of the readings were completely stable. Some cycled at intervals that suggested activity. Some were reading what I recognized from the engineer's medical training as cortisol and adrenaline response patterns. Heightened arousal. The things outside were agitated, and the instruments were logging it. The things outside had not escaped. They had not gone feral. They were cataloged. They were monitored. The estate's management, whoever the holding company connected to, and I was becoming fairly certain that the holding company connected to something that had the resources to maintain a facility like this for 30 years without it appearing in any public record, had been running an ongoing program. Not Rathbone's program. A continuation of it. A refinement. Rathbone had produced something that worked, after a fashion, and he had not survived the working of it, and whatever had come after him had decided that the working of it was worth continuing. I stopped following that line of reasoning to its conclusion. Because the conclusion had implications, I wasn't able to do anything useful within that room with those three people. What I could do something useful with was on the shelf at the back of the building. 5 fuel canisters, maintenance stock, the large format, red plastic 5-liter capacity with the sealed safety caps that break on first use, full or close to full by the weight of them when I lifted the first. On the shelf above them, a box of long-handled safety matches, the kind used for camp stoves and gas burners. Dry, full box. I set the first canister on the nearest table. I looked at the instrument panels. I looked at the ceiling joists, timber, old, dry in the way that very old timber in a stone building gets dry when the heating has been running for years. I looked at the shelving along the walls and the flooring and the door and the adjacent wall that connected this building to the next one in the complex. Kirsty asked me quietly what I was thinking. I told her. Ben said that was insane and asked what happened to the plan of getting to the car. Sophia said nothing. She was watching me with the expression she used when she was running a calculation, not agreeing or disagreeing, calculating. I waited while she ran it. She said the car route is compromised. I said yes. She said, if the instruments are live and being monitored remotely, whoever monitors them knows we're here right now. I said yes. She said, so they've had 40 minutes to decide what happens to 4 civilians who walked into their facility, photographed it, and read the labels. I said that was my reading of the situation. She looked at the canisters, she looked at the ceiling, she looked at me. She said, all right. Here is what I said to Ben, and I want to get it right because I've gone over it many times since, measuring the argument against what I knew and what I was guessing and what I was hopping. I said, they know exactly where we are right now. The instruments are active and reporting. The things outside are coordinating around this building specifically. Whatever is at the end of this line of command has had 40 minutes to make a decision, and the decision they're going to make is not to let 4 civilians with photographs and notes walk out of here and decide independently what to do with what they've seen. A door we can bar from inside is a door someone else can bar from outside just as easily. We have 2 options. We wait for whoever runs this to finish deciding, or we take the decision away from them. Ben said what the decision was, as if he hadn't been listening. I told him again. The outbuildings were the infrastructure. The specimens, the instruments, the monitoring systems, the 30-year accumulation of whatever Rathbone's program had produced, it lived in these buildings. Without the buildings, the program had a problem so large and so public, fire engines, police, investigative consequences, that the 4 of us became a smaller problem by comparison. Not safe. Smaller. Sometimes smaller is enough. Kirsty said the creatures would move when the buildings burned. I said yes. She said how did I know they'd move away from us rather than toward us. I said I didn't know that for certain. I said I thought that fire was old enough and fundamental enough in biology that what ran from it in the direction of away, not toward, regardless of what other directions it had been trained to run in. I said I thought that because it was what I believed, not because I could prove it. There was a pause. Kirsty said, all right. We worked methodically. There was no other way to work. Methodical was the only available version of calm, and calm was what the situation required from us. I took the first canister and ran a fuel line along the wall beneath the instrument panels, soaking into the baseboard and the wall cavity insulation behind it. Ben took the second and did the same along the opposite wall without being instructed, which was the right thing to do and which I noted. Sophia and Kirsty moved the heavy central tables to create a barrier inside the connecting door to the adjacent building, not to stop the fire spreading, but to slow it, to buy us seconds on the far side of the exterior door. The remaining canisters went down in pools on the floor, across the shelving, into the specimen storage foam, which I had a feeling would catch extremely well. I told them to get to the exterior door and have it ready to open. Ben asked if I was absolutely certain. I said no. I said no because I was not going to lie to him about it. I had a reasonable belief that this would work. I had no certainty. Certainty was not something the situation offered. I struck the match. The first fuel line caught with a sound like a long exhale, a blue-orange line running along the baseboard faster than I'd expected, the old dry wood beneath the paint catching immediately. The instrument panels lit from below, the panels themselves beginning to smoke as the heat reached the electronics behind them. The readings on the nearest panel jumped, some of the monitored subjects registering a response, and then distorted as the panel's own integrity failed. I moved to the door. Sophia opened it, and the cold outside air hit the fire the way cold air always does when it finds hot air with fuel to sustain it. It fed it. Behind us, the building filled with light and sound that scaled up faster than I'd expected, the old timber and the foam and 30 years of accumulated dry material taking it in the way parched ground takes rain. We ran. I took us southeast across the open ground, not the track, open ground where I had sight lines and could adjust. The fire behind us was immediate and enormous. I could feel its warmth on my back within the first 20 meters and see our shadows thrown 30 feet ahead of us, running shadows on the pale grass. The first shape came out of the trees on our left. Fast. That modified not quite running, covering ground at an angle that put its path and our path intersecting in approximately 3 seconds by my estimate. I had nothing in my hands except the empty fuel canister I'd been carrying without knowing why, and I threw it at the shape because it was what I had and because I am apparently the kind of person who throws things at threats when the alternative is nothing. The canister hit it, it didn't slow. Sophia turned left without breaking stride and drove her shoulder into it. She is not large. It was considerably larger than a person, broader, lower in its mass, and it was moving. What she did was not a tackle in the way football means tackle. It was an obstruction, a half-second of interference, her momentum going sideways into its forward line at the moment of its commitment to a direction. It knocked her down. Hard. But it knocked the shape sideways, and the 3 seconds it took to reorient and identify new bearings were 3 seconds I used to drag Sophia upright by her jacket and change our angle 15 degrees south, putting more separation between us and the tree line from which it had emerged. Ben was already south of us. Kirsty was with him. We ran. Behind us the second outbuilding caught, not from anything we'd done, but from the fire spreading through the connected wall cavity, the old dry insulation carrying it faster than any deliberate plan would have managed. The light behind us doubled, and then more than doubled as the fire found the roof of the second building and opened to the sky. The night became something between night and a furnace edge, warm, orange, enormous, our shadows multiplied and sprawling ahead of us. The vocalization changed. That coordinated, clipped communication we'd been hearing, it broke apart. The rhythm fractured. Individual sounds went up from multiple points around us, some of them high and ragged in a way the earlier sounds hadn't been, some of them cutting off mid-phrase. The herding pattern collapsed. The sources of sound moved in ways that were no longer tracking us, some toward the fire, some away from it, one sound moving north at what sounded like speed and not slowing. What I believe is this. The fire did what I'd hoped it would do, which is present a stimulus old enough and fundamental enough to override the program. Whatever training or calibration Rathbone's successors had layered onto those things, underneath it, something old enough to predate the modification responded to fire the way that old something has always responded to fire, which is by going away from it as fast as possible. The coordination failed because the individuals failed. And the individuals failed because somewhere beneath what they'd been made into, they were still subject to the things that all biology is subject to. We made the tree line. I kept us moving south through the trees using the fire for navigation. The orange behind us was a compass point, keep it at your back, keep going. A third structure caught as we moved, then a fourth. The light through the canopy was enough to run by. The sounds from the estate were chaotic and diminishing. Ben went down. He caught a root with his left foot, the kind of root that lies flat against the ground and presents a lip that a running foot slides under, and went down at speed and did not get up immediately. I heard the sound of the impact, and then the sound he made, which was short and controlled and said more about how bad it was than a longer sound would have. His left ankle was the wrong shape. He was on his feet before I could reach him, but the stride was gone. He was covering ground on will rather than mechanics. I came up on his left side and took his arm over my shoulder, and we kept going. He said something as we went. I don't know what it was. I wasn't listening. He said it once and then he stopped saying things and concentrated on the ground ahead, and I concentrated on the ground and on the distance between us and the tree line's end, and we kept going. The trees thinned. The track appeared on our right, the right track, the rutted gravel of the road we'd walked in on, and we took it south. The car was where we'd left it in the lay-by. No one had moved it, nothing had followed us to it, and it sat in the starlight looking profoundly ordinary in the way that ordinary objects look when they appear in the wrong context. Ben's keys were in his jacket. He got them out with hands that were not quite steady and dropped them, and Sophia picked them up and got the driver's door open. Ben went into the back. Kirsty went in after him, Sophia into the driver's seat. I took the passenger seat and kept my eyes on the mirrors until the car was moving. Sophia drove us out of that track the way she drove in London traffic, which is with absolute conviction in the intent regardless of the obstacles. We bounced off the grass verge twice in the first quarter mile. She did not lift her foot. The first town we reached south of the village had a 24-hour petrol station with a fluorescent forecourt and a clerk behind security glass and a landline that worked. I called emergency services and said there was a fire at the Rathbone estate and gave the road reference from the map that Kirsty still had in her pocket. I I said there was a fire and there were buildings involved, and that there might be people in the vicinity who needed medical assistance. I did not say anything more than that. Everything more than that is part of a process, I was told, explicitly and by people with credentials that end conversations, not to discuss in this context. What I can tell you is that the fire burned for most of the night. I know that from the glow on the northern horizon when we were sitting on the tarmac of the petrol station forecourt, all four of us with our backs against the wall, not talking much, waiting for something official to arrive. The glow was steady and large and not diminishing. It was not the glow of a contained incident. Ben's ankle was fractured in 2 places. It healed with a hitch in the stride that comes back on cold days. Sophia's shoulder, where it had met the shape in the open ground, was bruised in a way that bruises normally aren't, the coloration wrong, the outline wrong, the shape of the impact not resolving into anything the doctor who examined it could identify with confidence. He called it impact trauma and left it there. Kirsty lost half her notes in the fire. What she kept, she's been careful with. What she does with them is her business. And I have been sitting here for an hour now telling you what I can tell you about what happened on that estate. And I am going to close the account with the thing I keep coming back to in those early morning hours when the mind does its honest work. They built it to last. Baron Rathbone and whoever came after him built something patient and careful and controlled over 3 decades, with stone walls and monitored systems, and coordinated creatures and protocols for the contingencies they could model. They had resources. They had time. They had infrastructure that had survived 30 years of operation without appearing in any public record. They did not have 4 people with bad information, a box of matches, and the simple refusal to be studied. They modeled threats they could imagine. They did not model the particular quality that I have spent many years watching people either have or not have, the willingness to do the irreversible thing in the moment when the irreversible thing is the only thing left available. They modeled organized threats, deliberate threats, threats with preparation and resources. They did not model 4 people who followed a story to the end and found themselves out of better options. That gap between the threats a careful, systematic operation anticipates, and the threats it doesn't is not a small gap. I believe it is the most important gap in any system that has ever tried to contain what people will do when the alternative is being contained. We walked out through the smoke because the car was to the south, and I knew how to navigate by stars, and none of us were willing to stop. Ben walked on a broken ankle because he was too stubborn to be catalogued. Sophia walked because she'd made a calculation and decided the odds were better moving than still. Kirsty walked because she had half her notes and unfinished work and questions that still didn't have answers. None of us walked out because we were supposed to. That's the whole of it. That's the part I will keep coming back to for whatever time is left to me to come back to things. They built it to hold. We were not interested in being held. I have been asked since what I think should happen next, what I think should be done about what is on that estate, or what was on that estate, or what might still be on it in some form I'm not aware of. People who ask that question are usually expecting a policy answer, a call for investigation or for disclosure or for some organized institutional response. I don't have a policy answer. I have an observation. The things that ran that program, Rathbone, and whoever came after Rathbone, they believed that the correct response to something dangerous was to contain it, to build walls around it, to monitor it and feed it and keep it in a state of controlled operation where it served a purpose they had defined. They believed that the right kind of institution, with the right kind of resources, could hold anything. I think that belief is wrong. I think it was wrong about the things Rathbone made, and I think it applies more broadly than that. Containment is a tool. It is a tool with a failure mode, and the failure mode is that the thing being contained eventually encounters a circumstance that the containment was not designed for. When that happens, the containment fails, and the failure is usually fast and usually complete. The alternative is not a better containment. The alternative is the thing we did in that outbuilding with the fuel canisters and the box of matches, which is to say the alternative is the irreversible option, taken at the moment when it's available, before the window closes. I am aware that this is not a comfortable position. I am aware that the irreversible option is also the option you cannot take back if you were wrong. I am aware that I could have been wrong that night, that the things outside could have been something other than what they appeared to be, that the instruments could have had an innocent explanation, that the entire reading of the situation could have been the product of fear and darkness. I wasn't wrong. I know I wasn't wrong because of what those instruments showed, and because of what I saw move in those trees, and because of what the shape of the bruise on Sophia's shoulder said about what had hit her. And I know I wasn't wrong because of the quality of the official response when it came, the speed of it, and the nature of the people involved, and the questions they asked, and the questions they specifically did not ask. But I am prepared to sit with the discomfort of knowing that the irreversible option is also the one you can't test in advance. That is what it costs. That is the price of doing the thing that a careful, systematic operation doesn't anticipate. You have to be willing to do it before you're certain, because the window where you're uncertain is the only window available. The glow was north when we drove south, and then it was behind us, and then we drove far enough that the dark ahead was just the dark, no orange in the mirrors, and I watched the road and did not look back.